My name is Rafe Gray. Not my real name, of course. I cannot divulge my real name for reasons that will become abundantly clear as you listen to this podcast. This is the second episode of a podcast about a murder that took place in Burton-on-Trent in the late 60s. In March 1971, a person local to the town discovered a body on a small island in the River Trent. The body was and is referred to as Fred the Head. The island was not easily accessible and still isn't, even today. It is a secluded spot opposite the Royal Oak pub, which at the time the locals called the Sump Hole. You see, I know who the murder victim was and who killed him. There is copious information on the internet and in the press about this case, but most of it is based on conjecture, third-party testimony, and, to be honest, misinformation. Fred was discovered, interred in a kneeling position. His hands and feet were bound with cord. He had torticollis, a deformation of the upper spinal cord that resulted in Fred's case as a visible and perceptible crooked deformity in his neck. I knew Fred and had met him on several occasions around the town. I disliked him intensely. Why? Because I knew that he had a sexual predilection for young boys and girls. In short, he disgusted me. How do I know so much about the murder? Well, I was there when it took place. But before talking about the murder, I want to continue what I started in the first episode, in which I summarized my now deceased Uncle Horace Gray's past. At the end of the first episode, I mentioned the appearance in Burton-on-Trent of one Quinlan O'Hara, a man who was posing as an Irish traveller and living at the gypsy camp in Tatenhill on the outskirts of Burton. Having heard that Isabel Mulligan, Seamus Mulligan's daughter, was running a counterfeit money operation in the town, Quinlan travelled from Ireland to Burton to kill her. He wanted to get revenge on Seamus, his former boss, for double-crossing him and putting him in jail. Quinlan had bribed his prison guards and escaped to England. After hearing from Horace and Uncle Bill that Quinlan had first-hand knowledge of the Mulligan criminal empire, Sir Stanley Carpenter enlists Quinlan to help get to Seamus Mulligan. Sir Stanley strikes a deal with him. If he agrees to help capture rather than kill Isabel Mulligan, and to capture Seamus Mulligan and his right-hand man, Patrick O'Brien, Sir Stanley would use his influence in Whitehall to get the Irish authorities to erase Quinlan's criminal record. Quinlan agrees immediately. Back at Rush's garage, Ruth, Christine's sister, tells Horace that he should continue to run the garage because she and her family want nothing more to do with it. Ruth, Christine's young son, Chris, and Fisher's wife, Jean, all go to Derby to live in secret with Ruth's elderly grandmother. Only Horace knows where they are and, should Fisher turn up, promises to warn and protect them. Horace agrees to Ruth's proposal and hires some of the young gypsies from Tatenhill to help him keep the garage open. He also takes advantage of Fisher's absence to break into an old bakery building in town that Fisher uses as a warehouse to hide stolen goods, and moves a large quantity of them to a friend's farm where he stores them in a barn. Horace continues to run errands for Isabel's operation until that is Fisher, who is still in hiding, warns her that Horace is probably spying on her and will betray her to the police service. Fisher wants her to kill Horace. Isabel arranges to meet Horace at a local pub and takes a number of her henchmen with her. But Horace lets Quinlan and the gypsies know about the trap, so they surround the pub, rescue Horace, kill the henchmen and capture Isabel. They take her to the Tatenhill camp, from where Jacob Menzies' men collect her, and transport her to a Secret Services location to be interrogated. In parallel, Sir Stanley's team determine that one of Horace's nemeses in the Burton police force, Inspector Smart, is on the Mulligans' payroll. Sir Stanley arrests him, and he too is taken to a secret location, tortured and interrogated, but dies before he can reveal any important information about the Mulligan syndicate. Sir Stanley and Jacob discover that the Mulligans are planning an arms shipment to the Yakuza in Japan. They later discover that Fisher is setting up his own arms deal with the Triads in Hong Kong, and that, in fact, he is doing so without the knowledge of his partners in crime, the Mulligans. Deciding that the stakes are now much higher than they previously thought, Sir Stanley and Jacob arrange for Horace and Uncle Bill to accompany some Secret Service agents to Ireland to locate and capture Seamus Mulligan and Patrick O'Brien. They sail undetected in a trawler from Liverpool to Killybegs, County Donegal, where they wait for information on Seamus Mulligan's whereabouts, which the Secret Services determine is Limerick. Horace, Uncle Bill and the other agents travel to Limerick, where they eventually kidnap Mulligan and O'Brien, return to the trawler with them and sail back to Liverpool. Once in England, the Secret Service takes Seamus Mulligan and Patrick O'Brien to the same facility at which Isabel is being held. They didn't realize at the time that one of Seamus Mulligan's generals, O'Sullivan, would assume command of the syndicate and attempt to complete the arms shipment to Japan. However, later on in the story, Horace, Uncle Bill and a group of Secret Service agents thwart O'Sullivan's plans when they discover and capture 3 barges on the canal system heading towards Liverpool. The barges are fully loaded with large quantities of pistols, rifles, machine guns, bazookas, grenades and explosives. In the meantime, Sir Stanley arranges for Horace to befriend Seamus Mulligan's youngest daughter, Millie, who worked as the manager at a popular hotel in Birmingham city centre. Millie was distraught that her father had disappeared and was vulnerable. Horace posed as a travelling salesman and stayed at the hotel, where he eventually seduced Millie. Once their affair was well established and Millie had grown to trust him implicitly, Horace used her to try to obtain as much information as he could about her father's organisation. Many of Millie's father's associates in the Mulligan and affiliated criminal organisations stayed regularly at the hotel, but despite her incessant inquiries to them about her father's whereabouts, none of them knew what had happened to him or his right-hand man. Horace knew, of course. Unfortunately, Millie was not as knowledgeable about the details of her father's operation as Sir Stanley hoped. Horace was unable to glean any new information from her, not only about the Mulligans but also about Fisher, which was his real motivation for agreeing to the exercise. After losing his arms shipment, O'Sullivan travels to Birmingham and discovers that Millie is having an affair with Horace, one of the protagonists involved in the capture of the shipment. He gains entry to Millie's and Horace's room and tries to kill them both, but Horace overpowers and kills him. Millie has a mental breakdown and is taken to a sanatorium, where she dies of heart problems a few days later. Having ascertained that Liverpool was the place from which O'Sullivan's arms shipment would depart, the Secret Service turns its attention from Birmingham to focus on the Liverpool docks. Fisher had been hiding in Dundalk arranging his own arms shipment to Hong Kong, and was a frequent visitor to Liverpool, where he was making final arrangements for his arms cache to be loaded onto a ship at the docks. It is in Liverpool that a Secret Service agent spots Fisher in a hotel there. Fisher foolishly stayed at the same hotel in the city, under the same assumed name, a name which the Secret Service now knew. They determine the date and time of the ship's departure and hatch a plan to capture their target. Sir Stanley arranges for one of his female agents to phone the hotel in Liverpool, posing as the now-deceased Millie. She talks to Fisher in an Irish accent and lies to him that her father had disappeared but has resurfaced, and wants to meet him at the docks to discuss urgent business. The secret meeting is to take place on a trawler that is moored not far away from the very ship onto which Fisher's arms were to be loaded. Fisher agrees to the meeting and arrives at the docks at the appointed time, accompanied by his henchmen. They stand alongside the trawler as Fisher boards, but the Secret Service agents are lying in wait and dispatch them easily. Fisher is bound and gagged and thrown into the hold of the trawler, where finally Horace will exact his revenge on the man who caused so much suffering, not only to him but also those close to him. Early on in his friendship with Sir Stanley, Horace had relayed to him his burning desire to be the one to kill Fisher, a request to which Sir Stanley was more than happy to accede. Horace asks the captain to set sail a few miles out into the Irish Sea. It was in the hold of the trawler that Horace kills Fisher. It is the place where Fisher suffers a drawn-out, painful and undignified end. All of the aforementioned activities are mentioned in the 5 books that I wrote about my uncle. The story in the books ends with Fisher's death, but there is much more to tell about Horace's life, hence this podcast. You see, having experienced and done the things he did at such a young age, my uncle eventually ended up embarking on a criminal career that only ended with his death in May 1992. His involvement in the Secret Service and the criminal underworld for several years had forced him to walk an impossibly slack tightrope. If he fell to one side, he'd become a self-serving committed criminal. If he fell to the other, he'd still be involved in the criminal world, but the authorities would deem his activities to be justifiable. It took Horace approximately the 6 years that spanned his national service and extracurricular Secret Services training for him to wobble and fall. He was very much leaning towards the committed criminal side when he eventually did so. Sir Stanley sent Horace to the Royal Marines Depot, Lympstone, formerly known as the Royal Marines Depot, Exton, a commando training centre that was established in 1940. Horace was around 17 and a half at the time. The aim was for him to spend a few months there to prepare him for his national service, which, with the right guidance, would lead him to become an elite and committed agent of the Secret Service. The training at Lympstone was grueling, but he passed with flying colours. At the age of 18, Horace was placed at the Leicestershire Military Transport Base at Wymswold. This suited my uncle down to the ground, because it allowed him to continue to work as a mechanic, servicing and repairing a range of vehicles. He excelled at his work and didn't find the tasks he'd been assigned at all challenging. In fact, he found plenty of time to travel regularly to RAF Newton in Nottinghamshire, where he flew training aircraft and obtained his pilot's license. But he also found time to do other things, one of which was to retrieve and move the Mulligan's old printing press from a now derelict building in Burton to the farm of a friend of his in Nottinghamshire. Following his stint at Wymswold, the RAF moved Horace to Halton in Buckinghamshire, a place that specialised in all manner of technical, communications and aviation training. It still exists today. Due to the work he'd carried out for Sir Stanley, the Secret Service steered Horace gradually towards the intelligence disciplines of the armed forces. His brief was to gain entry into the Force Intelligence Bureau so that he could have pretty much unfettered access to a range of military establishments. Whilst at Halton, he trained for and became a military policeman to facilitate this progression. Overall, it was to take 4 years of service for Horace to be fully assimilated into the FIB. Horace spent 2 years at Halton, during which time he attained the rank of sergeant. Every week, he would visit the RAF base at North Luffenham, where a language school was established in the 1960s. The language school taught primarily Russian and Mandarin. Candidates proficient in one of the two languages would be deployed to monitor and intercept communications that emanated from the USSR and China. Those who learnt Russian were often sent to satellite Soviet countries, and those who learnt Mandarin were mainly stationed in Hong Kong. My uncle learnt Russian but was not deployed abroad. The Secret Service decided that his cooperation with them in the past, coupled with his newfound skills, would be of more use locally in the UK. The Cold War was escalating, and the number of foreign agents arriving clandestinely on our shores was increasing. The Secret Service needed someone who they knew could be ruthless, understood the criminal underworld, and was not averse to infiltrating it to pursue their targets. Having completed his service at RAF Halton, acquired a pilot's license, become a member of the FIB, and learnt to speak Russian, Horace spent 1 year training with the Special Air Service. It was after completing this training that he decided that he no longer wished to be a full-time member of the RAF and became a reservist. It was this move that allowed him to focus his attention on his private activities, but he still retained links to the Secret Service. It is at precisely this point in his life that Horace falls off the tightrope. Episode 3 of the podcast describes how Horace goes on to embed himself ever more deeply into the criminal underworld and how I became unwittingly involved in some of his misdemeanors. Thank you for listening, and, in the meantime, stay safe.